I'm Wesley Payne, Director of the Parthenon, and we are so glad that you are joining us for this highlights tour of our latest exhibit in the West Gallery, the original and only Harry Shepherd. That's all I'm going to say because I want to introduce you to Mark Medley, our curator, who'll take you on this highlights tour. Please enjoy and come to see us in person whenever you can. We'd love to have you.
Hello and welcome to the Parthenon. I'm Mark Medley, and we are standing here in the West Gallery with a new exhibit called This is the Original and Only Harry Shepherd. And we're really pleased to be able to do this exhibit, especially as February is Black History Month. And this is the story of a very courageous and talented man named Harry Shepherd. Basically, the whole thing started a number of years ago when I discovered someone actually inquired. They wrote in and they said, "Do you have the photograph by Harry Shepherd? He won a medal at the Tennessee Centennial Exposition." And I'd never heard of Harry Shepherd. And I started digging into it and realized that he was a very prominent Minnesota photographer and that the Minnesota Historical Society had all of these images that belonged to him. And then I continued to dig into it and I found this story of Mr. Shepherd, and it's true. In October 1897, it was published in the paper that Harry Shepherd had won an award of excellence for his photography at the Tennessee Centennial Exposition. So that's his Parthenon connection. And basically, the story goes into this. Shepherd was from Virginia. He moved to Minnesota, not completely sure how he learned the craft and art of photography, but he eventually did open a photography studio in Minneapolis, and he it operated roughly from 1887 to 1905. During that time, Shepherd was also he was an activist, and in the 1890s, this was really a time of segregation. It was the Jim Crow era, and Mr. Shepherd didn't like that, and he worked tirelessly against it. In this exhibit, basically, we have a number of images that are from his studio that were made by him. He ultimately became good friends with Booker T. Washington with the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama and made portraits of Washington and helped Washington develop a public image not only for himself but for the school. And we were able to get these portraits. This was one that was actually some of Shepherd's photographs that are at the Library of Congress. Ultimately, it's just the story of a man who was working against the odds to make a change socially. And he is ultimately going to have his photographs exhibited at the World's Fair in Paris in 1900. So this exhibit basically is the story of Shepherd using images that he did and telling his story. And as I said, it's the story of a really courageous and talented man. All right, so as I said, Shepherd opened his first photography studio in 1887 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And one of the things that he specialized in doing there was making what's called a cabinet card. And that's what this is right here. In fact, this is from Shepherd's first studio, the People's Gallery. And ultimately, cabinet cards were a little 5x7 card. If you went and wanted to have your portrait taken by a photographer, you would go and they would make a photograph that was basically on a piece of photographic paper thick. And usually the photography studio would have their logo at the bottom. And that's what we have here. And this is the portrait of two women in Minneapolis, an early portrait made by Shepherd. And ultimately, Shepherd was going to change the name of his studio from People's Gallery to the Harry Shepherd Photography Company. This is a Harry Shepherd portrait of educator Booker T. Washington. And as I mentioned, Shepherd was a social activist. He was devoted to social equality for African Americans. And in this process, he became acquainted with Booker T. Washington, who was the founder of the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama. The Institute was devoted to teaching African Americans trade and skills that they could use to become viable members of the community. And Washington was very devoted to this philosophy. He also, as I mentioned, Shepard helped him in developing his public image and the public image of the school. And they were friends, and at one point, Shepard and Washington were discussing Shepard teaching photography at Tuskegee Institute, and this didn't ever happen, but we were left with this wonderful portrait, and we got this from the Library of Congress. And as I had mentioned, he started out at People's Gallery, and then he changed the name to Shepard Photo Company. And one of the things that all of these photographers, and there were many, they were making cabinet cards, as I had mentioned before, and they were entering these images in expositions around the country. And Shepard was very proud of the fact that he had won 4 medals at the Minnesota State Fair. And so he started putting these medals on his cabinet cards to show that he had won these awards. Harry Shepard made portraits of all different types of people in Minneapolis, people of all races, all social standings. And this portrait is actually of the Minneapolis's fire chief, Hart N. Cook. And it was from 1897. This would have been the same year that Shepard won the award at the Tennessee Centennial Exposition. And again, it's a great example of a cabinet card. These are actually blown up. The real cabinet cards would be about 5 by 7. They're just like this. And so we're able to blow them up and see the detail in them. And again, it has the medals from the Minnesota State Fair that Shepard was so proud of. And he would make many different portraits. At one point he had 3 different studios going, and he had multiple photographers, and it has raised the question of whether or not he made all of the things that are attributed to him. There's really no way of telling that, but we're left with some really wonderful visual images from the time period. This is another montage of the Minnesota State Legislature. And, as a social activist, Shepard had gotten involved in political circles, and I believe that's how he was selected to make portraits of each member of the legislature in 1903. He would have photographed each member and then put all of the images into a composite that he would have produced. This is going to get near the end of Shepard's time in Minneapolis. Ultimately, 2 years later, he's going to leave and move. Some people believe he went to Chicago, others think he might have gone to Seattle, but despite being prominent in the paper in Minneapolis, he's not really ever heard from again. But we're left with images such as this that are wonderful to look at, as well as historical documents. So as I mentioned, in 1905, Shepard sold all of his businesses. He even had a company that didn't do anything but just make photography chemicals. He sold everything and left, and according to the paper, he went to Chicago, but he was never heard from again. And Shepard was a very, as I've mentioned a number of times, very brave man. To be an African American, to go into the South and preach social equality in the 1890s is one of the most dangerous things I can think of. Shepard was a great artist, he was a great activist, and we are really very pleased to be able to share his images with visitors here at the museum.